Hello, my name is Mia Albrecht, and I'm going to talk to you about the book Racism in America. So, this book was written by Annette Gordon Reed. She is an American historian and law professor at Harvard Law. Where this book was released at. So, what is the book about? Basically, Gordon Reed talks about racism, especially African American racism in America, specifically the United States. Um, she also talks about how people were treated then and how they how being treated then now is like ingrained in our social structure. So, what kind of evidence did she use? She used a lot of, so each chapter she would start with a quote, or she would start with a quote from a scholar or someone who lived during a pretty big event that, and the quote is leading into the topic that she would talk about. She uses a lot of her own experiences when it comes to current day, how she was treated. She's a black woman. She cites a lot of evidence that is current to what she's talking about now. So a lot of the evidence that she uses is taken from the 21st century. A lot of what she's saying is stuff that is all current. And some chapters she uses basically it's just all about one person and how they were affected by racism and in their certain time and situation. So the overview of the chapters. So she starts off by starting with today, and this book was written pretty recently. So it starts off talking about George Floyd and everything that happened with that, and then she really jumps all the way back to the slave market. She goes on about the violence over land with Native Americans and how they just accepted U.S. domination, and yeah, she keeps going by talking about the Southern horrors, about when like during the times when the United States it was okay to have slaves. She talks about how people would not treat their slaves properly, and even after the Emancipation Proclamation, how Southern whites tried to hang on to what they had control over by raping, murdering, theft, and just ostracization. And this stuff all happened very locally on the local level. She continues on by just giving a lot of examples of real people. So like things like riots that broke out, motions to fight racism that sometimes fell flat and sometimes, did something. She goes on about how the KKK and how they presented themselves in their culture and that day. She also talks about how white men tried to impose themselves on African American people, but didn't want to cross racial lines. So where that line was, she talked a lot about how things like that got fuzzy. Then she dives into African Americans in the World War One and how everything was just kind of like, well, what do we? She continues on by talking about the condemnation of blackness. She says, quote, that African Americans died 2 more times than whites, and how they blamed it on Darwinism. But that got pushed back on when the numbers actually came out and when things actually started to hey, this is not actually what's going on. She talks in another chapter about the bias in healthcare and how they were treated, black people were treated worse than other minorities. She also talks about the emergence of identity and the war on poverty and crime, which kind of led to the war on drugs, and how, that just was a lot of laws just criminalizing minorities, and kind of leading into more of that. She talks about ghettos and just kind of what is it, and she has a lot of sources and a lot of people talk about why it should be abolished. She also talks a lot about slaves and free marriages and how that kind of all happened, what was the culture, what was the social norms. She also talked about the triangle of race, ethnicity, and nation, which is basically just who you are and who you present yourself in this, nation, kind of all nations, but she really stayed in America because the book is called Races in America. She talked about black banks, which I thought was very interesting, in how the racial wealth gap, and she cites a lot of sources and she's got a lot of numbers about just sometimes the lack of change and how legislature had to get involved just to help support, local banks. She talks in just one chapter about the Chinese violence, execution, and the alienation of these people and how it kind of happened post-Civil War. She talked about the anti-Mexican violence in Texas happening in the late 19th and 20th century. She talks a lot about elite colleges and just kind of like failing disadvantaged students. She was a black student in like an elite university, and she talks a lot about how she felt like how she didn't really like have anybody like her in these big schools. She talks about a small town in Missouri that really like they kind of mixed all races together after in the 60s, and how she was surprised by that. And to end off, she talks about the art in a time of mass incarceration, just how she gave a lot of art examples and just kind of like how art changes throughout incarceration times, and she kind of relates it to being black in today's age. That was her final chapter. So what are the strengths? There's a lot of good things in this book. It's a really good book. She incorporated a lot of people's experiences, which can be hard to do because a lot of people do just kind of say things sometimes, and it's not really like worth a value, but she found a lot of good sources, and they were very detailed. They kind of connected to her, topic, and she used a lot of theoreticals, which I thought was very interesting. She used a lot of like, let's assume, let's imagine that, and for weaknesses, I felt like I was kind of wanting a little bit more like in depth of like other races' point of views during that time, but it also makes sense because she's a black author that she would write about black things because that's what she knows and that's what she's well versed at. And she didn't really make a point. There was a lot of good information and there's a lot of good things. This book is described as a reader, so not really like an argumentative kind of book, but just kind of things like that. And alright, overall thoughts. I thought it was a good book. If you really want to know more about different bubbles of the African American culture in the United States, I would recommend this book highly. Thank you.